Let me start with a quick question. Yeah, thanks. How many folks in the audience work or run non-profit organizations or in some way are involved with delivering education services? Okay. And how many of you are funding organizations in some way funding education ventures, education initiatives? Okay. And how many from the government involved in education? All right, perfect, excellent. Well, it's good to be here. Good afternoon. So what we'll talk about today are social. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So we'll talk about social impact bonds, relatively new concept. So we'll talk a bit about what it means, how it works, and then I'll share one example with a non-profit organization in India, which has developed and is currently executing the first such instrument in the realm of education anywhere in the world. Okay. So just quickly, typically, how do non-profit programs work, right? You have, if people are familiar with this model, you have certain inputs. You have your people, you have your funding, you have your technology, resources. You use those inputs to do certain activities. You teach students, you run camps, you do outreach programs, communication programs. You get certain outputs. We conducted so many hours of training. We ran, so many events, etc. Right? Those are the outputs that you can count. Those lead to certain outcomes, which are short-term changes that you see in your beneficiary population or the people that you're working for. And then in the long term, you have certain grand impact that we expect. Society changes. People have got better quality lives. Children grow up to be self-reliant, good citizens, economically self-reliant, etc. Right? And this is how, as non-profit, this is what we pitch to this is what we promise to the donor. We say, we'll run this program. You give us the inputs. We will run these activities. This is how many we'll do, and these are the outcomes and the impact that we will see over time in society. Outputs are easy to count. Right? I trained so many teachers, I taught so many children, we did so many classes, we did so many camps, very easy to count. The impact, however, is much harder to measure, because especially in education, impact happens, you have to sort of see a child 20 years later sometimes to see, was he well raised, or is he becoming a good citizen or not, is he economically independent or not. It's also very difficult to attribute what caused that impact. Was it the parents? Was it community? Was it your program? Was it something else that happened along in life that has led to that impact? Right? So very hard to say, I did this today for a child this year in 2016, and in 2025, this is how the child is doing in life, and that was because of the work I did. Right? It's very, very hard to do that. So now what's the challenge for donors in all this? When a donor typically makes a commitment to a non-profit organization to fund the work, they aren't really clear what will happen, because again, the outcomes and the impact is very far away in terms of time, right? So they don't really know what's going to happen, what will really be the impact of this program, right? They usually make a multi-year commitment. We'll fund this program for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And it's very hard for them to exit. I mean, unless a non-profit really is committing fraud or is completely off track, it's very hard in today's environment for a funder to say, you know what, I don't think you're doing what you promised me. I want to cut the funding, because ultimately you're trying to do something for somebody who needs a service for the children out there. And it's very hard for them to say, well, I'm sorry, but I don't like the work you're doing. I want to stop the funding, right? It's very tough for them to do that. And especially if a funder is open to scrutiny, like let's say a government department trying to give money to a non-profit organization to run a program, if things don't go as planned, if the promises are not met or the expectations are not met, it can open them up to scrutiny about why did you give money to this organization and not that. The funding could be better used for some other cause and not this. So there are all these complications for donors as well, right? And for non-profits, as we talked about, it's very hard for them sometimes to measure and communicate the impact that they're going to have with their work. And because of this, what happens for non-profit organizations, they tend to make a 5-year plan. They say, each year we're going to do 3 of these, the next year we'll do 5, then we'll do 8, and then we'll do 12, right? They try to make long-term plans today on what they're going to do with their program. They tend to give budget, so many people, so much travel, so many computers, a very specific budgets that they submit to their donors. And this reduces their ability to innovate and to respond. Because, I promised my donor that I would do 25 hours of training in year 3. Now, by year 2, I know that the hours of training is not really working, but I'm reluctant to go back and tell the donor, look, this is not working. Can I do something else with your money? Because then that guy will think, Manas doesn't know what he's doing, so can I really trust him to do his work? And therefore, sometimes we just keep doing things that are not always the most effective, but because we have committed to doing that, we continue doing it, right? And also then how do you motivate your team? When you don't have that adaptability, you can't respond to change, you can't change things the way you want to, how do you keep your team motivated that, are they really doing the best that they could, right? So the outcome is donors tend to make small grants. That's a way of risk mitigation for them sometimes. They tend to repeat what has already been proven, or that at least what is proven on paper. And they tend to want very accurate reporting on exactly what are you doing with the money, how many of these activities are you doing, and sort of trying to control things in that way, in a sense. And for service providers, they therefore need to go to multiple donors to raise the money that they need. Multiple donors may come with multiple priorities. Somebody wants you to work over here. Somebody says, do this, but no, do it in this different region, right? Do this in this geography. Or, I don't want you to do stuff for 8 to 10-year-olds. Can you adapt this program for the 11 to 15-year-old audience, right? So you keep getting into these complexities. How do you scale it up? That's always the question. What's the incentive to innovate and do better? If your donor really wants you to stay with what's proven, and you've already committed the next 5 years what you're going to do, then how do you innovate? And therefore, how do you invest in the capabilities of your team to be able to innovate and do better and better every year, instead of kind of repeating what you have done before with some small modifications? So this is where the social impact bond comes in, and this is kind of the structure of it. And I'll explain how it goes. So you've got sort of 5 or 6 key players. Typically in your service delivery model, you really have these 3, right? You have somebody who's giving you money, a donor or a government or someone. You have the service provider who is providing the service, and they provide the service to some group of beneficiaries or partners or different terminologies. But what you do in a social impact bond is an investor, we'll call them an investor, not a donor. They give money to a service provider to say, okay, go out and achieve certain results, do this activity. The service provider uses that money to provide the service to a group of people. Where it gets interesting is that you have somebody who is going to now measure the impact of the work that is done over here, right? So you have a very, very strong component of impact measurement. And this player, this person, will tell somebody who we'll call the buyer of results, say that, look, this is what is expected. We expected that grades will go up by 20%, or that enrollment in schools will increase by 30%, the retention in school will increase by X amount. This person is going to measure that impact and tell the buyer of results that this is what's actually happened. And based on those results, this player is going to repay this party who had given originally the funding to the non-profit organization or a social business to provide the service, right? So unlike the traditional model where this person comes and tells the donor, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, give me the money. The donor gives the money, service is provided, but sometimes it's not really clear what the impact of that service was. Here you have somebody who funds the program, and if the program does well, if the service provider does what they're supposed to do, then there's some other third party that is going to repay back this investor, right? And this investor, if things go really well, they may actually make a profit, so they make a return on the investment that they made. So imagine that you're running a school, you say, I'm going to teach 100 children, and these are the scores that they'll achieve, which may be, let's say, better than the score that they would normally achieve in another school, right? And I go and I convince this investor that, look, I can do this, right? I can deliver this really great results. He'll say, okay, I'll give you the money to do it. And then we go and find somebody else, let's say the government or a larger agency, that does not typically want to directly fund this guy, because say, look, if you don't achieve the results, then I've given you the money and I've got nothing in return. But now you say, well, only if I achieve the results, then you repay me, right? And that's how a social impact bond basically works. And we'll move ahead and see an example. So what are the benefits for the service provider? The service provider is promising an outcome. He's not saying, I will train 50 teachers to teach 200 children for 600 hours, right? He says, I will improve grades by X amount. He doesn't say, I will survey 4,000 houses and make a database of all the children who are out of school. Say, I will get 600 kids back into school who are currently not in school. Or I will reduce the percentage of out-of-school children in this district by 45%, right? So they're promising a certain outcome, and they don't have to justify how they will do it. And that gives them the flexibility to respond over a 3 to 5 year program period that if something is not working, they can change tactics, because at the end of the day, the buyer of the result, the end payer, will only pay if they achieve those results. So it gives them a lot of flexibility. It can be scalable because it's the end payment is based on achieving the result. You can say, well, this year you do $100 program, next year let's make it 200, 500, easy to scale it. And they have an incentive to achieve the impact or the outcomes, not just do certain activities. So that gives them scope to innovate, motivate their team, etc. For the buyer of results, like I said, a lot of the, especially with government, they're reluctant to pay NGOs, they're reluctant to take the risk of something different or innovative, because if it fails, it can be difficult for them. This mechanism gives them a chance to take those risks, because if it fails, they don't have to pay, right? So it allows big money to come into the social sector. And for investors, they can have potential upside if the instrument works very well, service provider achieves their goals, they have a financial upside, okay? Some examples, we've seen some work with prisoners in the UK and the US. So the NGO promises the government that if 100 people are released from prison, you have rates of, let's say, somewhere between 50 to 70 will be back in prison, let's say 2 or 3 years down. That's the historic evidence. They say if we can reduce the number of kids or people who go back into prison, so then they'll work with the kids and keep them out of prison. We saw something with diabetes management and sleep disorders, where DFID funded a program saying if you can reduce sleep disorders by X percentage, then we'll pay you, right? The process is you need to understand what your outcome is. Okay, this is very important to understand. Who's your target audience? Are you going to set an absolute goal? We'll reduce number of kids out of school by 10,000, or is it a relative goal? Because then relative, if you say 50%, you have to first determine how many out of school kids there actually are, and then say what is 50% of that and how you will achieve that. And then we'll talk about mission creep in just a minute. Second step is you always need a program manager. It's a pretty complex tool, a lot of parties involved, so you need somebody who has done this before to design the whole program for you. And then look at the financial model, because now it's not a line item based that I will give me this money, I will spend it to do this. You need to always watch your costs, because you may change your program, you may change the way you do things, and so you need to know what your costs are to make sure you stay within budgets. Then you want to identify who is the buyer of the result and who is the investor. Then you negotiate various agreements and set a formula for payment, right? So if the program is, let's say, $100 and you want to reduce the number of kids who are out of school, improve attendance in school, and improve learning outcomes, you need to say how much of that $100 is going to go towards each outcome, right? And then how the payments will happen, who will monitor impact. You need to have a tested and proven model for this. You can't experiment on this because you're already taking a lot of risk on the money. You need to have, there's a very rigorous assessment process. So you need to have an organization that has done rigorous assessments before. And you need to have a good team which is willing to learn and adapt and change. I will leave this out. This is just about the girl-child education scenario in India. Just go to Educate Girls, the NGO that implemented this social impact bond, or that is implementing it in India, established in 2005. They now work in 6 districts across 8,000 government schools with about 1 million children. The program started just by saying, let's get girls into school, right? So that was the first, what the organization was set up for. Once we got them into school, they said we now got to keep them in school, and kids would drop out for various reasons that you're aware of. And then once we keep them in school, they're not going to stay in school long term until they learn something useful, right? So to get kids into school, there's a lot of community engagement, door-to-door work, convincing families, working with village seniors, overcoming a lot of the social and cultural and financial biases against sending girls to school. To keep them in school, we had to work on building toilets, making the school safer by building boundary walls, getting more women teachers into the school so that girls and their families felt safe, and engaging the school management committees to become more active. And then to improve learning outcomes is again, working with volunteers who can help the teachers improve the quality of education. We have brought 80,000 girls into school over the last 8 to 10 years, improved attendance, affected learning outcomes, engaged large number of community volunteers, and 20%, 27% of the schools we work in have got better, have toilets for girls now. Earlier they did not, and especially as girls move, past the age of 10, 11, toilets become a big factor for dropping out of school. So what did our social impact bond look like? I'll go through this a little quickly. We set two desired outcomes. We said we will reduce the percentage of out of school girls, and 20% of the total amount was towards this. Now think about this, right? The original purpose of the organization is to just get kids into school. But when we started negotiating with the donors and the funders, they said, look, we really care much more about learning outcomes. And therefore, as an organization, we have to say, are we willing to bet our money on delivering learning outcomes? Or is our real strength in community mobilization and overcoming the barriers to get girls into school? And ultimately, it took us 2 years to say, yes, we are willing to commit to these kind of outcomes versus just focusing on getting girls into school. So that took a lot of thinking and planning internally. We appointed a program manager, a wonderful organization based in Cambridge, US, Instiglio. We then designed sort of what our growth plan will look like, geographies, territories, what the operating model will be, what the cost will be internally before we even went out to find the funders. UBS, the Global Investment Bank, their foundation is providing the capital, so they're the investor into this. And the Children's Investment Fund Foundation is the buyer of the results. So if Educate Girls delivers the results that are promised, then CIFF will repay UBS. And if we achieve all our targets, UBS stands to make a 10% profit. So if they gave us $100, CIF will pay them $110, and they will share 30% of that upside. They will share back to the NGO, back with Educate Girls. So we have that added incentive to do well. It'll cover 18,000 girls in 166 schools. It's a $400,000 program, $422,000. Okay. What to watch out for? Design very carefully, right? I mean, we had a lot of thinking, changing internally to make sure that we can deliver what we are promising, that we can build up the team, we can build up the processes to deliver what we are promising to this investor. Ensure that there are no perverse incentives. And what I mean by that is, NGOs, they tend to be more trusting than corporates, right? And typically in business, you want to make sure what can a guy do to achieve his goals in a dishonest way, right? And for example, we would find where the volunteers, instead of teaching the teachers on how to do something, they would work directly with the students, because it was easier just to do it with the kids instead of training the teacher, helping them to then deliver services to the kids. But this doesn't work in the system, right? So you need to watch out for saying, what kind of shortcuts could my team try to take, and how do I block that, right? Then we did a lot of work on aligning metrics across the team. So all our different teams have to do similar models. If something has to change, how do you learn from their experience, adapt the model, and go round and round the learning curve as quickly as possible. And then there are various complexities you can build in, and I'll just talk about one of them, and I'll take 1 or 2 more minutes. Then I'll use Sir's, the extra time he gave us, I'll use that up. But here's something like tariffs, right? So tariffs are if the buyer says, look, I value that you bring a girl from a certain group of beneficiaries, and I value that she's bought into school more than somebody else, right? So if I take a backward class, for example, in the Indian context, you have the backward classes, which are, really, really sort of, the conditions are much worse than a regular rural poor family. And they say, if you bring a kid from a regular rural poor family back into school, I'm willing to pay you, let's say, $10. But if you get somebody from the backward classes, I'm willing to pay you $20, right? So then the team can spend more energy, that incentive to work for that group of people. And threshold says that, look, if you can get up to 10 kids, then I don't care that much, that's okay. I'll start paying you if you get more than 10. And these are all just complexities that come into the model and make it a little more complicated to measure what's been achieved, not achieved. So we stayed away from all this. We said, first time, it's a small program, $400,000. Let's keep it simple, right? And then keep an eye on the changing costs. I mean, lot of NGOs are not very good at tracking their costs on a real-time basis, and you don't want overruns at the end of the year saying, oh, we don't have money to finish what we were doing, right? So that's sort of how the structure works. It's been short. I hope it gave a quick overview. And if you have any specific questions, happy to take that in Q&A. Thank you.